for folks who couldn't make it today. We know everyone's very busy, particularly right now in the legislature. So welcome to Alaska Food Security Week. This is something that we ramp up for all year long. We love hearing from our other partners in the food system, the Alaska Farmland Trust, the Alaska Farm Bureau, the Alaska Food Coalition, and we are grateful for the work that they do as well. Other thank yous today, Representative Liz Snyder sponsored today's Lunch and Learn. So thank you, Liz Snyder. Regrettably, she could not be here with us today, but I just got a text message with a couple remarks. No, I didn't. Okay. That's okay. Okay. Thank you, Liz. The communications didn't come through today. We also want to thank Representatives Tar, Rauscher, and Kronk for their continued support of Alaska Food Security Week as well. And we do want to take a second to acknowledge the broad spectrum of lands that we are on. We recognize at the Alaska Food Policy Council that the lands that we live, work, and play and eat from are indeed Indigenous lands. And for those who would like to learn more about that, we love sharing this resource. If you text your zip code to that phone number, you can learn about the lands that you are on. And Robbie might be able to chat that later. So quickly about the Alaska Food Policy Council, our goal is to create a healthier, more secure, and more self-reliant Alaska. And I think that if anything is clear from the 2018 earthquake and this ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, it's that we can always do more to be a more food secure state, especially with our location here at the literal end of the food chain. To learn more, you can check us out at akfoodpolicycouncil.org. And again, our mission and goals to connect, inform, and advocate. We welcome any Alaskan who is excited about food systems, who is concerned about food systems, to join us. And so this is what we're here today to do. We'll start out with just a few slides about food transportation context. What are we talking about in the state when we say food systems transportation? Most people think of a food system as a linear chain from production to transportation to processing to storage to probably more transportation and storage, retailers, wholesalers, end consumption, and then waste. And all along the way, food is moving. And so how does that food move along the chain? Well, turns out it's a lot of humans and a lot of equipment that make that happen, and often a lot of money. So we're here today to talk about this, some of the challenges that we've seen. We invited a panel of 6 or 7 experts to tell us their experiences about moving food around Alaska. And please, we encourage everyone to use the chat feature on Zoom. So if you have questions throughout, we will be monitoring the chat and we can interject when appropriate. So please feel free to do so. So why are we here? A couple months ago, we had the 2020 Alaska Food Policy Council conference. We heard a great call to action from the community that they wanted more information about food systems more than every 18 months, which is when we offer our conference. And so we really wanted to prioritize conversations about transportation, particularly around bypass mail and the Alaska Marine Highway System. The Alaska Food Policy Council is gearing up for a USDA-funded Regional Food Systems Partnership Grant. Very exciting. It's over $100,000, and we were elated to receive this. And it will result in a 10-year statewide food systems strategy report. And we've pulled in 13 communities from around the state to help us do so. So please stay tuned if you are interested in that. So that's what we're doing here today. We're informing future reports, we're informing our decision makers, and we're facilitating more conversation. It is no secret that the Alaska Marine Highway System, as well as our bypass mail system, has been in the news, is consistently in the news, and is top of mind for a lot of people. The further off the road system you get, the more important and critical our transportation systems are, often because there is no backup. There is no redundancy. We are also in Alaska ever vulnerable to our weather systems, which is, it's not new. Weather is not new to us. It doesn't make it any more, it doesn't make it any easier to move food around the state. We put out a survey after the first food transportation webinar this year that we did in January. And this is what the survey respondents had to say. We asked them what their top 3 concerns about food transportation are in the state. You can see most prominent, people talked about cost, community, local food, rural places, and availability. We then asked them what they felt their community's particular biggest challenge was to accessing fresh food. Again, when we look at food systems, food security, we know there is no silver bullet. We know there is no panacea. And we realize it is a complicated answer and often very important to localize. So what does more distributed production, storage, and processing look like? But in the current short and medium term plan, what does it take to get more consistent access to food in the state? And I will end this part with a couple key quotes. Some really fantastic suggestions came out of this. We will continue our food systems discussion series for the rest of the year if you are interested. But important to highlight what folks were saying. The first point talking about these unintended consequences that often arise from well-intended policy or practices or protocol. How do we continue to prioritize Alaskan production? How do we continue to ensure rural communities have consistent access to food, and not just food, but healthy, fresh food? And that's what we are doing here today. Here's the key points we will talk about with our panel. Mostly we want to know what we can do to make things better, what the policy opportunities are. And here are our expert panelists. And we thank them for joining us here today. It is always so much fun to put a panel together. And I am always so touched by how willing folks are in this state to engage in this system. We firmly believe that food systems work is policy work, and it affects everyone. And so we're very grateful to have a broad spectrum of representation here today, from direct-to-consumer farmers to some of our largest distributors across the state. And you can see we have Admiral Tom Barrett here from the Alaska Marine Highway Reshaping Report Working Group, Bob Laurence from Begich Capital Partners, Emily Garrity down in Homer from Twitter Creek Farm. Gideon Garcia is on the phone today with Northern Air Cargo, Jim Baldwin from the Food Bank of Alaska, and Walt Pickett from the AC Stores. And this panel is moderated by Brian Himelbloom, who is a member of the Alaska Food Policy Council Governing Board, and he is based down in Kodiak. So thank you everyone for your time today. I see that we do have Rep Snyder here who showed up. Hi, Rep Snyder. I did not get a chance to read your comments. If you would like to say a few words, that would be great.
Sure, I'll hop in just a minute. Thanks for your patience and letting me hop in. I am so pleased that this is happening again this week. I wanted to say thank you to all of the amazing food advocacy and policy organizations that have made this week possible, and to our incredible set of panelists today bringing a diverse perspective. To your point, Rachel, food systems are complicated. I think we know that. We can say that, oh my gosh, yes, that's me. Yes, and to Representative Tarr and Rauscher and Kronk, who all co-sponsored this, I was so honored to be able to join them from this side rather than from the advocacy side where I've spent some time. But we know food systems are complicated in terms of geography, equity, and justice, the different handling and shipping needs of different products, the different components, nutrition, all these things that are affecting availability, accessibility, and utilization. And while we're talking mostly about issues of availability today, which include the production, harvesting, packaging, and distribution or transportation of these food items, we know it's part of a larger system, right? Things around accessibility. What is the cost of that food? How far is it from people who are trying to access that food? As well as the utilization. What's the nutritional value? What's the cultural value? Is the food safe to eat once it arrives? And looking at the list of, we have a great group of attendees today, but speaking in particular to my fellow legislators and to any staff members that are joining us today, being very thoughtful that we couch today's conversation in this broader view and broader context, because we're working on things here in the legislature on behalf of all Alaskans, things that affect the cost of energy, the cost of healthcare, the availability of education, the funding of capital projects, which support the development of infrastructure on which we rely to transport our food. So I just wanted to highlight that this is we're focusing in on one thing, but it is also interconnected. And food security is ensured by a strong food system. And a food system is only as strong as its weakest link. So I am so pleased. Again, I want to say thank you again to the organizations that have made this week possible and make sure that we're having these conversations, elevates these conversations, and contextualizes them into some of the broader, even more diverse work of the legislature. So Rachel, thank you. And thanks for letting me rattle on a moment. I'm so excited to be here.
Thanks a lot, Rep. Snyder. Well, without further ado, I'm going to remove my PowerPoint so we can see our wonderful guests today. And Brian, I will turn it over to you, and we will take the next 45 minutes for discussion. And again, please feel free to use the chat for some Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for joining us during this wonderful webinar that we have provided for you. I think the first thing we're going to do is do a quick round robin of our esteemed panelists, and just jump in there. I know sometimes there's overlapping conversations, but I'm just going to step back and just make sure things don't get out of hand, and we'll let the 6 panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the 4 questions that have been presented to you.
Why don't we start out, we'll just go down the list and call your names out. Why don't we go with Admiral Tom Barrett?
Hi, thanks. I'm delighted to be with you, and hope you can drive some positive improvement over time. My background, my original background was Coast Guard. I had a number of, actually 4 tours up here. We lived in Kodiak, Juneau. Now we live in Anchorage, and I recently retired from the Alyeska Pipeline. And I had a time in DC also with USDOT. So transportation has always been near and dear to me, and undertook with some other real fine Alaskans this study of the marine highway system this past year. We've put a report out. You can find it on the Alaska DOT web, and I'll talk to how we listened and what we heard about security and the context from the system around that when you have time and want to hear.
Thanks, Admiral. Let's go with Bob Laurence, please.
Hey, my name is Bob Laurence, and I am in charge of Begich Capital Partners. It's a partnership between myself and Mark Begich and Nick Begich. And we took over a grocery store in Utqiagvik approximately a little bit over a year ago. And so we've got a lot of experience in the challenges of operating a grocery store in rural Alaska. Prior to that, I was President and Chief Operating Officer of Grant Aviation, and experienced quite a bit of how bypass mail works. The focus for me was in Western Alaska, primarily Yupik communities. And so I've got a lot of experience in basically, the highs and a lot of the lows of bypass mail and the challenges and some of the systemic failures involved. And other than that, I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Emily Garrity from Twitter Creek Farm.
Hi there. Yep, Emily Garrity from Twitter Creek Gardens, and I'm down here in Homer, and I own and operate a small diversified vegetable farm just under 2 acres. And we sell through several avenues, one of them being a 100-member food subscription, otherwise known as community supported agriculture. I sell through the Alaska Food Hub, the Homer Farmers Market, and wholesale to restaurants and to local grocery stores. And most recently, I've included 2 farther communities from Homer, both Girdwood and Juneau. So I'm familiar with the difficulties of managing logistics for food transpo across the state. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Emily. Gideon Garcia from Northern Air Cargo. I know Gideon was on the phone. I'm going to ask you to unmute. We might come back to Gideon. Jim Baldwin from the Food Bank of Alaska.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jim Baldwin, Food Bank of Alaska. I've been working in the food bank industry for going on 25 years now. Started off with the Hawaii Food Bank and the Colorado Food Bank, and now currently in Alaska. I'm not sure that I have as much to contribute as my esteemed panelist, but obviously the Food Bank of Alaska, trying to serve those less fortunate throughout our state, relies so much on the various transportation industry that Rachel mentioned. One thing I would just like to mention, I think it wasn't mentioned earlier because we were focused on, or it was mentioned that bypass and the marine transport, but I think, our port system here, so much of what we rely on comes through our port. And a huge shout out to our main carriers out here, Matson and Tote. And during this time of the pandemic, the port kept running and we kept receiving goods. And without that lifeline, we would be in certainly a much more challenging position than what we were in during the COVID response. So I look forward to answering more questions and talking in a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Jim. And I thought I saw Gideon pop on. Want to give him? There we go.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Hey, certainly, thank you. Yeah, this is Gideon Garcia, Vice President, General Manager for Northern Air Cargo. We've been serving rural Alaska for almost 65 years, delivering food, freight, and all the other essential commodities for everyday living, serving as far north as the North Slope from Utqiagvik, over to Northwest Alaska, Nonecots, and down to Southwest, King Salmon, Dillingham, and many other locations. And we're one of the mainline carriers for the bypass mail system. Proud to serve our customers in rural Alaska, and glad to contribute to this conversation today. Thank you.
Thanks, Gideon. And let's round it out with Walt Pickett from the AC stores.
Thanks, Rachel, and it's an honor to be here. General Manager of Alaska Commercial Company. We operate 34 stores throughout rural Alaska in 28 different communities. We also have a wholesale arm. We service approximately 100 other retailers throughout the state, much smaller communities. So this is an exciting opportunity for me because we're always looking to improve. And especially this time of year can be very challenging given transport limitations and weather. Thank you.
Okay, I think we concluded the intros. Thank you, Rachel, for shepherding us through that. Now we're going to turn our attention to the 4 questions. And again, it's going to be kind of open season because I don't know specifically your backgrounds, but these are very general questions. Let me start out with the shortest question we have, which is question number 4. Are there any policy changes that Alaska should make so that food transportation is easier?
This is Tom Barrett. I have one, and it's in the report, but the ferry system struggles with budget, but it's not just dollars, it's the way it's funded. And we had 2 legislators on the work group there, Senator Stedman and Representative Stutes, and they're well aware of this. But the system could be forward funding. I saw an article just in the last day or 2 about cake getting off the schedule and getting it put back on. Scheduling is very hard. A business in tourism typically forward schedules a year or 2 in advance. And this system is unable to forward schedule more than a couple of months. And it's because it doesn't have a line of sight on its funding stream for the next couple of years. The law allows it, but the policies have never been implemented by the legislature or a variety of administrations to actually allow them to long-term plan with a confident expectation of what funding to expect. And if they could if the funding stream picture was better going forward, you'd have more reliable, more consistent, and more predictable scheduling, which I think impacts the reliability of the food transport.
This is Gideon. If I could just piggyback on the Admiral's comments about policy of CapEx purchasing by the state and funding. We're dependent as an air carrier on airports that are cleared of snow and debris and are long enough and maintained and have staff to run them. And the state of Alaska is the largest sponsor of airports in our state, which is unusual. Most states, it's counties or cities. Some of the infrastructure is getting older, and some of the runways need to be longer. And those type of opportunities for forward planning and making sure we meet our capital improvements to get the federal matching grants makes a big difference for the reliability of aircraft to be able to fly into remote locations. So that would be the one comment as an air carrier we could contribute to that conversation.
Would anyone else like to contribute to this one, or we can move on to another question and come back to this one?
This is Bob, and the only thing I would add, and this one I'm long on problems and short on solutions, but the entire bypass mail system and the way that we access anything that is not on the road system or on the marine highway system is through air transportation. And I'm kind of moving away from the larger carriers like what Gideon's group does and so forth, and thinking more of the Part 135 carriers that fly the 208s and the 207s and so forth to the small communities. So the federal government completely controls, sponsors, and administers these programs with minimal input from the state of Alaska. And so, the whole idea of bypass mail was that it's incredibly difficult to operate an air carrier to these remote villages and have it fiscally make sense. So the government subsidizes those activities. The challenge is that there are issues like, we use NAC and Gideon's group, and they're great. And everything we send through them is insured. So if there's some damage that incurs the shipping along the way, we have product that's spoiled because it didn't hold temp or something like that, it's insured. Bypass mail, nothing is insured. So once something enters the bypass mail system, it can experience all sorts of abuse, and it does, and nobody's accountable. And so it's a challenge. The other thing is that bypass mail is low priority relative to human passengers. So when you have a Part 135 carrier that can only make so many flights and has their own challenges, groceries take a low priority to people moving back and forth. And there's a lot of wisdom behind that, but it doesn't help from that standpoint. The other thing is, in really underserved communities, they have what's called EAS, or Essential Air Services, where the federal government subsidizes the entire operation. So like a grant, it's a good contract in that you wake up on the first of every month and the federal government may wire $1 million into your bank account for you to service these communities. But there's no controls or accountability in terms of what you're actually doing. So, when I was at Grant and we were very struggling with transportation, we were short on equipment. We've serviced communities that had weather challenges. And also in the aviation industry right now, there's a huge pilot crunch that was initiated several years ago by federal law changes, where it's incredibly difficult to recruit and retain pilots to fly in rural Alaska. And so these all work to make it very difficult to safely and efficiently transport groceries to remote communities. And the only people that really have any influence over it is the federal government, which, as we've seen, depending on which administration it is and what's going on, things like bypass mail and EAS routinely get put up on the chopping block by various senators and legislators for either being defunded, removed, or whatever, because people still have a hard time in the lower 48 conceiving the idea of a community not being serviceable by anything but an airplane. And, when I was working at Grant, we'd often hear, well, just truck it up. And, at which point I encourage them to get a map and look at where we're trying to truck that to. And if they have any great ideas on how to do that, we're all ears. So at some point, the state has to really think about what is its role going to be and provide, in influencing air traffic and transportation in the remote parts of rural Alaska. These are the non-A zones. So I'm not talking about COTS or Nome or Barrow or Bethel or something like that. I'm talking about when you get out to like Good News Bay, where I have friends and I've go out there periodically and spend a week and hunt and fish. And it's fantastic, but man, is it hard to get groceries out there. So that's just my quick 2 cents.
Much appreciated. And just picking up on what you mentioned, Bob, the other transportation link that really hasn't been mentioned, maybe as an oversight, is we have the Alaska rail system, but more than that, there's been some move afoot to have a rail system from, I believe, Alberta to Alaska, which would allow ground transportation. So I don't know if you want to pick up on that at this point. We can move on, but I should just alert that, there are some opportunities in the future that might make things easier to get more shipments into Alaska by yet another route. And they don't have to drive it because they'll just be moved by train. Let's move on to then one of the next questions that looks, so what opportunities exist for local, regional, and state collaborations and shared infrastructure for strengthening our transportation systems? And let's have Emily chime in on this one.
Well, in my experience, when I was trying to figure out transportation from Homer to Girdwood and Juneau, I felt very much alone in the process. And there's time constraints and financial constraints, and it feels like the major financial burden either falls on the producer or the consumer. And that's kind of going back to the previous question. But as far as collaborating, I was able to find another farmer that had a refrigerated truck that could transport my CSA chairs from Homer, make a drop in Anchorage, which then went to Alaska Airlines cargo, shipped down to Juneau, hopefully same day, and then made a drop refrigerated in Girdwood. So collaborating with other farmers, obviously, but I'm wondering how we could collaborate with, some of the bigger transportation companies like Alaska Airlines. It feels to me like they make millions of dollars from Alaskans every year. How can they offer some incentives for food transportation? So community aggregation sites, things that I'm sure have all been talked about. I don't know that I have any new ideas, but I can just speak to the difficulty has been and how alone I felt in the process.
Okay, and then Jim, we know that a lot of the foods that you receive are kind of are delivered to the food bank and then distributed. Could you talk about some of the opportunities or ways to make your operation more effective and efficient, if those are the correct terms?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, we're very fortunate. And again, I'll just put a shout out to both Matson and Tote because of the container ships coming in. They've offered up, free containerization, donated container ships coming in, or containers on their ships coming in to get food up here. And that is certainly a huge relief for us. But once it gets to the state, obviously, we still have a challenge of getting it out into rural Alaska. With Walt on the line, I think, this COVID, despite all of its challenges, it's brought some silver linings. We've been able to create new partnerships and new opportunities, new collaborations. The most recent one was with the CFAP program, the COVID food assistance program. The federal government, unfortunately, it just keeps extending, for 2 months at a time, and everybody can't plan ahead. But what it did was it opened up opportunities for us. Each time a new organization was awarded a contract and we had to figure out how to get it from point A to point B, AC stores stepped up and got food out to rural Alaska for us, to communities. We connected them with our agencies on the ground in those communities, provided the food transport out there. I think the latest round now, Charlie's Produce was awarded a grant, but Charlie's doesn't serve rural Alaska. So again, AC Stores is partnering with Charlie's to work with us and getting it out into the communities. So there's a lot of opportunities networking. So I think a silver lining of this whole COVID response is that it really has opened up new networking, new partnerships. But I think I'd like to just comment and then pass it on to the next one, is that when we look at capacity of the bypass mail, you know, we have a limited, it has to be at least 1,000 pounds to get on a plane to ship it out. And of course, that can be problematic for a smaller operation like us when we're trying to serve rural communities, as well as just the capacity for frozen and refrigerated product, getting it capacity on that. And I don't know if Gideon has more input on that as far as what's needed. And then I think Gideon, you mentioned just the improved airstrips in our rural communities to be able to accept maybe larger craft and better equipped to handle frozen and refrigerated. So that's my kind of 2 cents.
If I could add real quickly to back up there what you're commenting on, McGrath is a perfect example of a location. The runway is between two parts of the Kuskokwim River, a nice oxbow. Performance landing regulations by the FAA require a certain amount of space for an aircraft to land to have overrun in case it's icy runways. It's hard to expand the McGrath Airport any further because you're going to run into water. Aniak just rebuilt their runway and made it actually a little bit narrower, moving it 250 feet to meet FAA regulations. So we really need to be mindful and thoughtful about where we're building these runways. When you take federal money, you're obligated to follow the rules of the FAA. You can build your own runway and you don't have to follow the FAA rules as long as you can afford it. And that's the catch-22 of the airport improvement program, which the FAA provides 96% of the funding if you come up with your 4%. So there's some catch-22s there, but we do need to be mindful of that because the right airframe to serve some of these locations isn't being made anymore. Our good friends at Linden have a wonderful aircraft, the Herc, you know, civilian version. It's a great cargo plane. It's a very large payload though, and to be economically, financially viable to get a large payload into a small location during the wintertime with our 737s, when we go into McGrath, we're actually now facing a lower payload because of the runway conditions. And that's a matter of the length. And that's a hard constraint that we cannot find an alternate means of compliance with. And of course, if we can't go into full payload, we have to cover our costs. And so that sometimes means rate increases. So it's a frustrating dynamic, and there's a lot of constraints that we need to be mindful of. Briefly speaking to the freeze and chill, you know, the airport here in Anchorage has got a contract out for someone to build a large freeze and chill warehouse that could provide some opportunities. If there was a central large enough place for all the bypass mail to go to one location, that's freeze and chill, to be stored in a standard maintained way and then distributed to the air carriers straight from there. So there's some interesting ideas afoot out there, but we do have certainly some hard constraints in our state that we need to be creative to solve.
Okay, excellent. I'm glad the panelists are so wise. They've actually blended into other questions, so I don't even have to posit it out there. For example, you've touched on perishable food, and I think there are challenges. We all know that there are. In the chat, I put some information about cold cargo. But since this is a lunch and learn and for the benefit of legislators, I think we should spend some time on question number 6. What do you want Alaskan legislators to know about food transportation? And then the follow-up question would be, what can they do to help create a healthier, more stable, and inclusive value chain? And I'll just open up the floor and have at it.
Well, if there's I won't be shy here and bashful. I guess I'll just reinforce the earlier comment about consistent policy and commitment to capital investments by the state in our infrastructure, whether it's runways or roads or bridges. The transportation network needs to be supported. The good folks at statewide aviation with DOT do a great job of managing what they have to work with. But the current budget constraints, if we're trying to get into a location because maybe there's a weather cancellation earlier in the week, and we want to fly into a location and it's after hours, the DOT is carefully monitoring their overtime, as any good organization should, because they have a budget to watch. But if we're we only have 2 aircraft available to us. There's only so many hours in the day to get to a location. We have to make those flights up. And if the staff aren't available to clear the runway, we lose an opportunity to get into a location. So having that flexibility of being used to a 24/7 operation nowadays. In the past, I think we were all pretty fortunate in Alaska that we may not have had to fly as much, in the middle of the night. But as we're pushing our resources to the max, we need to make sure that the infrastructure is there to support us.
Gideon, this is Walt. I just appreciate your comments, because obviously, as we look at it from the retail side, part of it is as you mentioned, the airports. Part of it is the maintenance, but also there's a part there too that I think cooperatively we can I guess increase food security, increase the perishability. Part of the challenge we have right now is, Northern Air Cargo has limited refrigeration in some of the hubs. I know Alaska does too. So I think I keep coming back to the word flexibility, as you did, Gideon. The flexibility and working with, in cooperation with one another, actually having maybe a shared resource in these hubs for, and we talk about cold storage, both refrigerated and frozen. And I hear people talk all the time about dry storage as well. I look at it more as warm storage, because just as you're trying to ensure the viability of your produce and your frozen food, this time of year, one of the other things you got to worry about is product freezing as it's going out to these communities. So I don't know if anybody's ever seen a jar of mayonnaise that's been sitting in sub-zero weather for any length of time, but it separates into 3 or 4 different layers as the ingredients it's kind of like oil and vinegar, I think is a good example. But I think cooperatively looking at, especially these larger hubs, and finding methods in which we can have maybe a shared resource, both for refrigerated and for dry storage, would be helpful. And then those of you that have ever been out to, and Bob, I appreciate your comments, when you get out to these real small communities, it could just be a runway. There's no hangar, there's no storage area. And I've seen time and time again the product coming off of the planes, and it will sit on that runway, that tarmac, for as long as it takes the agent of the carrier to retrieve it and move it into the community. And just having a simple structure in these communities to actually get it out of the weather, I think would be beneficial as well. One thing we haven't talked about either, and we get into the flexibility of bypass, and Bob, you did a great job of kind of summarizing some of the challenges. But I think it's important, especially as we look at some of the challenges with the marine highway system right now. I know there's been comments from some of the smaller communities in the Southeast, and we really haven't touched on the Southeast here, where they do not receive the benefits of the bypass mail system. And with the reductions in the marine highway system, the limited frequency of barges coming into these communities, they face very expensive food costs because everything has to be flown in there at air freight rates versus subsidized bypass rate or on a barge or on a ship of some kind. So I look at it from the standpoint of just increasing the flexibility and the cooperation, as Jim kind of mentioned before too, of getting everybody together to work towards finding solutions. And hopefully the legislators can assist us in trying to find some of those synergies and some of those cooperative methods to solve some of these challenges.
And of course, being in Alaska, we have substantial challenges because the earth moves in so many different ways. And I just read an article saying that the grocery in Ketchikan will be closed indefinitely due to the landslide that occurred recently. And I was wondering if anyone had a patch for that for the residents of Ketchikan.
we'd be glad to charter airplanes down there to fly things if need be.
Okay, anyone else?
I don't have a patch, but I think that really speaks to the real issue, and that's food security. And I appreciate all the efforts that are going into beef up our transportation systems, but it really lies down to food production in these remote parts of Alaska, and how can policy promote food, land access and food production in those places. So that seems to me to be part of the real solution and the problem.
I
Emily,
want
did
to
you?
follow up on that comment.
Go
if I
ahead.
can. No, food security is a very compelling argument. And one of the things I think the legislators and actually the food security group is get the story together. There's going to be a huge amount of infrastructure funding coming out of the federal government sometime in the next year to 2 years. You can see it walking forward. At DOT, the way that works is the FAA will get a bunch of money for airport improvements. MARAD will get a bunch of money for vessel and port work, and that might include ferries. Highways will get a bunch of money for road. Rail will get improvement, transit. And when you get to rural communities in places like us, you want to be careful. It's going to be a positive environment for the federal dollars coming in, probably with some amount of small state match. But you want to be careful what you ask for. And I think one of the things that can be done is to take, as we're talking about, kind of what would an integrated, more collaborative, what would a good solution look like in rural communities broadly? Because the way these questions get asked on the Hill, it's not just Alaska. There are a lot of states in this country. They may have roads, but they're rural. They have some of the same challenges. They may not have earthquakes, but they got hurricanes. You know, it's all that stuff. But what is a solution that you want to ask for, and how do you fit that together so that the various funding streams that come across can provide a workable food security answer for remote communities? I just think you're looking at a variety of different pieces, all of which will get attention. But if we don't know what the right mix is in some community, you won't be able to get in line for that funding. That's just my thought, is be careful what you ask for, but there's an opportunity coming. And if we can tell a better story and make it have a long-term sense, I think it would be helpful. And I don't see a lot of that system work going on at the state level, quite frankly.
Would one of the other panelists like to add something to Admiral Barrett's comments or Emily's comments?
I'd like to circle back to one thing, and that is talking about contingency planning in case of disaster or disruption. You know, Gideon and I know firsthand from when Raven went bankrupt. They just locked their doors and they bolted everything and started chaining things up and so forth. So Nukiavik, the hangar that NAC uses that comes in, and the people that actually offload the plane and so forth are Raven employees, they're subcontractor. So all of a sudden we had groceries starting to pile up in Anchorage, and we had a concern about whether or not they would actually get on a plane, and then whether NAC would be able to land in Barrow or Nukiavik and be able to deliver them. And it was a real challenge. And it was interesting because in the spirit of Alaska, the local community basically said, we don't really care what the state says. And they commandeered the hangar. And we were in communication with everybody. And so the employees on the ground were gracious enough that we weren't even sure who was going to pay them and what, who they reported to, whatever. But NAC turned planes for multiple days while the mayor of the North Slope was in heated dialogue with the state of Alaska, and you had the Department of Law coming out and saying, you can't do this. And then you had the people in Barrow saying, well, we just did it and we're going to continue to do it because we have to have food. And that's, one example, but there's a lot of them. Another one is, it's interesting, but I remember when I was at Grant asking the question of what happens, and so an essential air service contract means it's a monopoly, you're the sole provider of a community. So what happens if that company goes bankrupt? I mean, Grant was in dire fiscal straits when I joined them, and my effort was to basically turn them around fiscally. And the interesting thing was when I said, well, what if we just don't fly to this community? What happens? And the only thing that really kind of consistently came up is it may be that the Air National Guard has to mobilize and do like a Berlin airlift and start, bringing in state assets to drop in groceries. And but it's not, if there is a plan at the state for this, I can tell you that the air carriers that I've worked with and communicated with don't know what that plan is. And so I think as a part of the, and again, we've got so much going on in Alaska right now, but we are, a disaster away from a humanitarian crisis in a lot of these communities. And instead of having to call up the Air Force and say, we need to use Pavehawks and start bringing in and sling loading, groceries, we should at least have some sort of a contingency where there's a pre-existing discussion about how that would happen when it needs to happen. So I just throw that out there because it's sort of like when things are working, we don't worry about it. That kind of summarizes sometimes in Alaska with oil and everything else. When it's great, it's great. And we only talk about things when something goes wrong. And the problem is then you're in a reactive stance, which can always lead to challenges.
Thanks, Bob, for that info. I posted, quickly looking for stuff on the web as everyone's speaking. There's a 2011 State of Alaska Emergency Operations Plan. I haven't read it. I haven't looked at it. I don't know if there's been an update to it, but it'd be very interesting to look at that document. I think it's 180 pages long and see what it's doing in regards to what you were just mentioning, Bob, about, what are we going to do about getting food in an emergency situation? Where are the MREs going to be coming from? That kind of stuff. I want to go back to Emily, though. It made a couple of comments about what the state of Alaska could do about food access and lands. Could you broaden that a little bit more about what a specific ask you would provide that's kind of a hurdle that could be overcome just to make food more accessible on a local basis?
That's a big question, and I wish I had all the answers to it. I do think that as a farmer, land access can be a real hurdle. So I don't know what the state can do to look at viable farming land and try to offer that up for operation to just be able to grow more food, and then to come up with programs. And I know there are some, but even bolster those programs to help educate members of Alaska in far-reaching villages to actually grow their own. So just increasing food production in state, and whether that's specific to producers or just community members, and how do we support them? I don't have all of the answers, but I'm definitely interested in learning some of the solutions, and we'll keep brainstorming how to make those things happen.
Great. Go ahead.
If I could just back up to support Emily there. I mean, the free market's a wonderful thing. And when we look at rural Alaska, I remember a few years ago, and I forget the gentleman's name, who was growing all the potatoes out in Bethel. He was using state land out there. I think it's at the end of the airport. To grow potatoes, and we got a tour of his root cellar there, and there must have been enough potatoes to feed Bethel for a year, it looked like. I mean, it was a quantity of surplus. And we fly airplanes full out to rural Alaska, but they come back empty because there's not a lot of production of goods and material. Summertime, we bring back a lot of salmon, coming back for markets. But if it helps at all, I mean, there is lift available. And I know a lot of folks on Saturday markets in Anchorage looking for fresh produce. I'd love to ship produce from rural Alaska that's grown on available land. If there's more land out there that can be grown versus in the urban built up areas, there could be a match there, and the free market can help provide food security and revenue streams for other folks and different businesses.
That's excellent, Gideon, because it kind of harkens on, well, wouldn't that be considered backhauling, that if you're going to fly out there, you can bring something back? And people talk about it, but I really haven't seen that be initiated on any grand scale, but I do know that it costs your company. You're going to have to fly to Fairbanks, you're going to all that kind of stuff, or truck it. And coming back empty is, well, you have to bring it back. It'd be good to have some kind of collaboration on that particular transportation issue. Anyone else on the panel would like to add something? We have about 10 minutes left.
I just want to say, I think that's a really great and valid point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. So, Mr. Garcia, and that's something that my farming colleagues and I have talked about is that back transport. The transportation systems are already in place, and how do we promote businesses in those farther reaching areas to even help some of the hubs that aren't having enough access to food as well. So very much appreciated.
I got a note from Rachel that if we have a lull, she's ready to ask a question. I know you've been very patient, Rachel. Go for it.
Sure. This wasn't, thanks, Brian, not an urgent question, but I do always wonder where else in the world we should be looking. I often think Alaska has more in common with sometimes even sub-Saharan Africa than we do with Iowa. And so looking outside our own, locus of control, our own environment to get inspiration for some of these backhauling opportunities or, asset sharing. So wondering if you have any in the world examples of ways that communities are working together with industry to create a better food system or to create more efficient shipping in general. I would love to hear about it. And we did not prep you for this question, so it is okay to pass, but something I'm thinking about.
I'm not quite sure if it's a direct correlation, but we have a sister company based in Hawaii, Aloha Air Cargo, and they do inter-island flights. And I got a familiarization tour there a few years ago. And one of the things they're shipping out is stud shrimp that go out to market to breed and make more shrimp. And of course, shrimp have to fly live. They've got to be in water, 8 pounds per gallon for water. That's a great dense freight to carry in that regards. And also a lot of taro was coming back from some of the farms in the outer islands back to Honolulu. So that was an example of a remote location that I think is very similar to us in some regards, although it's a larger population, but it's definitely a model of something to look at.
Okay, we're getting a lot of info on the chat. I'm just going to keep my eye on the screen here, Rachel and Robbie. If there's something that you see in there that you want to bring to the panelists, or panelists, if you have something that you haven't been able to espouse during roughly 7 minutes average per person, you have the floor. Thank you.
I want to make a pitch of just on the ferries, the report we did. A lot of the recommendations we made, like to improve reliability and maintenance. You've got an old system. It's not suited for a lot of reasons. You got great employees that work on it and work hard on it. But a lot of our recommendations have been made over many years, and they've, not by us, they've been ignored. Change is hard. And all I'm saying about the ferry system, if you don't make some fundamental changes in it, you're going to end up band-aiding some stuff, but you're still going to be in the same position we're in now, years forward. Our view was, if you want a better system, which addresses issues like food security and transportation and reliability, you're going to have to make some fundamental change. The will to make changes, I think, is something we all should be conscious of. It's not enough to have a good idea. Someone has to have the will in the legislature and in an administration to actually make change happen. And I see the ferry system as one where the ideas have been there, but they haven't been acted on. So thanks. So I encourage people to, read the report, and when they get an opportunity to weigh in on things they like, encourage people to take action on it.
I'd just like to give a quick shout out to the Alaska Food Hub and all the work that they've been doing to figure out some of these problems and find solutions to them. And they've been able to, in Homer, for Homer producers and Soldotna producers, to make sure that community members in Soldovia and Nanwalek and some more remote places have access to food. So they're starting a really excellent infrastructure and system that's working, at least in this region. So I think it's something that we can continue to learn from and piggyback, and hopefully maybe one day have a statewide food hub where it just really brings producers together to collaborate.
Well, if there's no more comments from the panelists, I'm going to turn this back over to Rachel with closing comments. How about that? And we can finish on time.
Great. We knew this was going to be a fast hour. Thank you, Brian. Again, the chat has been on fire. We are saving this chat, and we've recorded this panel discussion, which will then be put into a brief and posting on the Alaska Food Policy Council website. So we will share that out with everyone when it's available. I think the key message that I kept hearing is that there is no single solution. Collaboration is essential to survival, and that we have to be proactive. This can't just be, we cannot continue to be reactive every time there's a crisis, natural disaster or global pandemic. So we just really appreciate, Representative Snyder sponsoring today's event, the rest of the representatives, Rauscher, Tar, and Kronk, who have supported Alaska Food Security Week. I personally do not believe we can talk too much about food security, as it taps into every single industry and every facet of our lives. So resounding applause and thank you to our panelists for giving your time and energy. A lot of expertise here, and we'll try and capture that in our final report. So thanks everyone, and we'll stick around for questions, but everyone is welcome to go. That was a fast hour. Thanks.